This is the technique that I dislike the most. Pieces turn out gorgeous, but I really just hate making them. Hello and welcome back to the Little Craft House. Today we are going to be doing some faux rose quartz pieces. Now, yes, they are beautiful, but I hate creating them. I'll be honest, it's one of my least favorite techniques. It's the most requested tutorial I get asked for. So today I'm going to suck it up and I'm going to show you how to make these beautiful pieces, and hopefully I enjoy it a little more than I usually do. Come along and join me and let's get started. So first off, and probably most importantly, for us to be able to achieve this natural stone sort of look that we're going for with this rose quartz, is that we need to choose the right polymer clay to work with. So our best choice would be to work with translucents, and that will be able to give us that multi-layered effect that we're going for. So the white clay that I'm using here is actually Cernit translucent. Now, I didn't have any pink translucent on hand, so what I've chosen to use is the Cernit Opaline Pink. Now, the Opaline range is made up of a partial translucent within it, so it's not fully translucent but not fully opaque either, so it's just got a semi-translucent effect, so it will work for what we're doing today. So ultimately I would have preferred to have used maybe the Fimo quartz range. They've got a quartz pink, Fimo do, and I probably would have preferred that, but I didn't have any on hand, so I've just grabbed the Opaline instead. So as you can see with my conditioning here, this is probably one of the reasons that I don't enjoy this technique a lot, is that Cernit can be really temperamental when it comes to conditioning. So that Cernit translucent there was so crumbly and just hard to work with. The Opaline though, that's fine. This is just pretty much super easy to condition. So different colours condition differently with Cernit, and I think that's why I'm not such a huge fan of this technique. But yeah, so I'm just going to get these ones conditioned down and just make them soft and ready to work with. I know some people when they do this technique don't condition, but if you don't condition a clay that's hard, when you come to rolling it out later, it will crumble then. So we do want to make sure that it's nice and conditioned from the start. So I just mentioned how Fimo has a translucent range. And also Cernit has their translucent range. Sculpey Primo has translucent and white translucent. So if you do want to use those ones, you definitely can use those. And there are ways of tinting the clays too. So if you just had a translucent, you could use paints or inks or pigments to actually tint the colour as well if you wanted to do that. Again, I'm not a huge fan of doing that because it's super messy, and for a technique that I don't enjoy, I don't want to have to do extra work. Right, so I've got those clays softened down and they're definitely workable now. So now I'm going to do the whole choppy method. So however you want to achieve this, you can cut them up into small pieces however you like, just choppy until you get them all reasonably small, and just keep kind of mixing it up between itself, because you don't want to get big piles of just translucent and big piles of just the pink. You want to make sure that it's quite evenly spread out. And depending on how sticky your clay is, so my pink's quite sticky and the translucent's not, so that's where it's going to be a little bit clumpy. So I'm just making sure that I do have it mixed up enough that it's an even spread of colour throughout. So I've worked on this a little bit. I've got it all nice and chopped up, lots of different sizings of pieces there. Now I'm going to squish it to the side there and bring out a bit of baking paper, or parchment paper, I think some of you guys know it as, and I'm just going to now spread out that clay on there. The reason I've grabbed the paper is because the next part gets a little messy and I don't want it all over my tile, so just by putting it on the paper means that I can work on that. And if I was doing this and doing other projects at the same time, I would be able to just lift the paper up and move it elsewhere while I wait for it to dry, and then it's not going to get in the way. So I've just seen a few more big clumpy pink bits here, so just chopping those down just to separate them. I'm actually going to try a method that I haven't done before with this. I'm going to do a bit of both, a bit of what I normally do by using paint, and I'm also going to use some alcohol ink as well in this next step. Yeah, something I haven't tried before, but I'm hoping that it's going to work to give it a really nice effect. So I'm going to divide my clay here in half, and we're going to use paint for one half and alcohol ink for the other. So this is the opal alcohol ink, and down the bottom you've got all the flakes have all settled. So I'm going to give it a really good shake to get that all nicely mixed up. And I'm just going to grab my paint palette here, which is filthy, and I should learn to clean it after I use it. But luckily there is 3 clean spaces there. So once I have given this a really good shake, it's really hard to see that that opal effect through the camera here, and now it's also got all the bubbles through it as well. But it's got this beautiful opal shining iridescent effect. You can kind of see it a little bit there. That's what I'm hoping that we can spread onto our clay and hopefully have little bits of that visible in our final effect. So here's an example of what not to do. Don't try and pour your ink into the palette because you spill it all over the tile. Doesn't matter what I do with this technique, I always seem to get myself in a massive mess, which just adds to me disliking it even more. Anyway, I did have a syringe handy in my container of tools. I really should have just grabbed that in the first place, but I've grabbed it now after I've made the mess. So I'm going to use the syringe to grab out a bit of the ink and put it into the paint palette. And I'm just doing this now because I want some of that alcohol to absorb, because I don't necessarily need all the wet alcohol. I just need those opal flakes that are within it. So if I just leave it for a few minutes, some of the alcohol will absorb and it's not going to be quite as liquidy. I also need to give my tile a really good clean here because I don't want it to stain from that effect. I've done that before. I've left it too long and it's stained, so not what I want. Okay, so you can't really see that effect there, but believe me, it's beautiful, and we're hoping that's going to transfer into our final product. Anyway, I'm going to grab some paint. I am going to be using the Montmartre Dimensions white, zinc white this one is, and I'm just going to add that to the paint palette as well. I'm just going to take that seal off first. Add that to the paint palette. By adding paint to our clay, this is what's going to create the vein-like effects that the stone look has. So sometimes people will create this with alcohol ink. I find that the alcohol ink, if you're using a colour, it's not, I find it's not visible enough for me. So I like the paint. It's thicker and it's more of a solid colour as well. So I like using paint. You'll find some other people might use pigment powder or even add some foil in at this stage as well. But I'm just going to do the paint, and I'm not going to do foil because we're going to do those iridescent flakes from the opal alcohol ink. So going to do the messy part. We're going to try and paint this clay with the paint. So I want to try and get a bit of coverage over all of the clay. I didn't squeeze out enough paint there at all. I was a bit under ambitious, I think. We want to give it a nice coating, so I'm going to have to grab some more to cover it. Now, it doesn't take too long for your paint to dry, but I'm doing the paint side first because that will take slightly longer than the alcohol ink will to dry. So yeah, just giving it a good coverage, making sure that it's all covered nicely. And again, just making sure you're doing this on something that doesn't matter if it gets messy and dirty, because I wouldn't want to be doing this straight onto my tile. So when I've done this in the past and I've used the paint, I'll then just leave it for a few minutes. I'll probably just go and have some lunch, or just go and do another project just to try and make sure that that paint has dried as much as possible, because afterwards when we put it all together, we don't we want the least amount of paint going everywhere. So making sure that it is nice and dry. So now with the alcohol ink, you can see there how the opal effect has settled down into the bottom and the alcohol is just sitting above. So we want to make sure that we're going to get all those flakes as much as possible onto our clay. So I'm just going to kind of stir it back in and then start dabbing it onto the clay. So I think you can kind of see that iridescent effect. You can definitely see it on my paintbrush there. Yeah, look at that. See, beautiful. That is what I want visible in our final look. I think that will look really nice going through those veiny parts of the stone look. So again, I'm not sure if I've got enough, if I've tipped enough out. I might have to add some more afterwards, just because it's not quite going as far as what I would have hoped it would. Okay, so here it is, all covered in paint and also that alcohol ink. You can just kind of see those flecks there. In real life, it is actually a lot more of the iridescent effect happening. It's just really hard to pick it up on the camera. Right, so next up, we're going to put on some gloves because, as I've warned you, this is a messy technique. The ink and paint seems dry, but I know that as I'm going to start mixing it, I'm going to get it all over me. So now I'm going to mix up those two halves so that we're mixing the alcohol ink and the paint pieces through so that it's nicely mixed up. Again, I'm still keeping it on the baking paper just so we don't get any paint on my tile. And I'm just going to bring it all together and we're just going to form a bit of a log shape with all these pieces now. So I am getting paint on my hand and the gloves are making it a little bit tricky because the pieces are sticking to the glove, but we will power through it, collect up all those little bits and pieces that have come apart, and then we're just going to start pushing this all together to form that one piece again. So nice big squeezes, squeezing out any air gaps that are within and just forming that one big piece. Any kind of log style cane shape that needs slicing, I always find much easier to do in a squared off shape. So not so much just for the slicing component of it, but for the tiling. So when we're tiling the pieces together afterwards, if it's got flat edges, I find it so much easier to tile together than just rolling it into a cylinder style shape. So when starting out, I think we naturally go to like roll it together, but then obviously when you're tiling, circles don't go nicely together. You end up with gaps and then holes in your pieces. So I like to go with the squared off shape. So I'm using my tile here to flatten each of the sides. This is also squeezing out the air, pushing those components all together and yeah, getting it ready to slice. So if you find that your clay now is actually quite sticky and soft because we've been working it so much, pop it into the freezer or the fridge for a few minutes. It'll cool it down and firm it back up, which will make slicing much easier. Remember to wipe off your tools so that they don't get the paint stuck to them. And yeah, see, I've got it on my glove. Not too bad, but I definitely wouldn't want that on my hands or on my tiles. Okay, so I think I will be safe now to actually get rid of this baking paper. there shouldn't be too much mess transfer now. So we'll just pop that to the side. I was thinking about using the paper still, but I think I'll just pop it to the side there. Right, we're going to start slicing. So it's hard to see, I know, but you can see there's those pieces of the pink and the white, and I'm really hoping that that iridescentness stands out. So I'm just going to go along and cut even-ish slices. They don't have to be perfect. And either just turn your clay or just kind of firm up those sides again as it's squishing down. And also remember that when we bake this, it's going to turn, the white's going to turn into that translucent, see-through-ish effect. I'm going to now tile my pieces. So I don't want to do them all in a straight line. I want to make sure that any creases aren't going to be straight. This is going, and I'm going to overlap the pieces as I'm tiling them as well. This is just going to make sure that the clay holds together nicely and it's not going to easily break apart. And when it comes to rolling it down, if you've got any sort of guides that you like to use, I'll quite often use my slab square guide. I've got other guides as well. We have a whole range in our store actually. If you find keeping a consistent level of your clay is hard to do, use some sort of guide, and then that way you won't get your dips and bends in your clay. So now just with the roller, going to roll over it. You can see those gaps and lines closing up. And this clay is quite firm still from that translucent, so it is actually a little bit harder to roll out than what it normally is. And I don't want to put this through my pasta machine because I have a new pasta machine. Got it at Christmas time, and I really don't want the paint and those iridescent flakes to get stuck in there. So I am just going to do this purely by hand roller. So it's going to take a little bit to work it down to that thinner level. I'm just going to keep releasing it from the tile as I go because I don't want it to get stuck to the tile too badly that it then rips later. So a couple of millimeters thick is all we need our clay to be because we are going to put resin on the top afterwards. So I don't want my clay to be too thick, otherwise once the resin is applied it'll be too thick and chunky and too heavy. Again, I think it's a little bit difficult to see, but you can kind of see where the paint is in there, and I am a bit disappointed that I can't see the iridescent flakes. But here's the effect that we're going for. Holding up against the light, you can see the sun coming through it just slightly. Okay, now it is time for me to cut out some shapes. So I've got these silver linking rings, which I'm going to use as a bit of a border today on these pieces. Yeah, I just thought it would kind of give them a nice finish around the edge of them. So I'm just going to place them on. I think I had a cutter that was the exact size of these, but I couldn't find it. So I'm just going to freehand cut these shapes out. So once I've placed them on and I'm happy with where they are, I'm going to give them a little roll, and it's going to push those rings into the clay. Now this is not going to permanently hold them. So if you were to do this and you weren't going to resin on top, you would need to find a way to be able to secure those rings on. So sometimes if I'm doing these rings on a paste and I'm not resining, it's more of a matte finish piece, or if I'm just using the gloss, What I'll do is I'll bake with the rings on, then pop the rings off once it's all baked up, put a little bit of glue underneath the ring and then put it back on, and then that will hold it in position. The metal and the clay will not stick together as they are just like this. Maybe a bit of liquid clay might work, but personally I just prefer to put a little bit of super glue underneath, and that way I just know that they're going to stick. Otherwise, if you can put a bit of clay as a decoration on, that will also help to hold it. So you might want to do like some clay flowers or some clay leaves or something like that onto it, and then that will hold it in position. I'm also just going to cut some little study pieces out of this as well, just to use up some more of the pattern. And what I'll do is I'll put it to the side anyway. I think I might get a few more shapes out of it afterwards, but I'll decide on that after. Just going to get these couple of studs done. Now, if you're wondering about the scraps, you can still smush them all back together. You could add a little bit more paint if you wanted to. You could also add like your foil or something else to it, even another translucent colour, and then re-roll it back out, and then you could cut more pieces. It would just be less colour defined than what it is at the moment, because you're obviously going to mix it together more. So definitely can use all the scraps up. They don't have to be wasted. And for some reason, this peel just was not going my way today. It just was coming off in chunks. I think what happened was I got it stuck too much to the tile. So yeah, here we go. Just going to try and release it off the tile to make it easier to lift off all those scraps around. Also, another thing to mention, I don't mind if my pieces are a little bit scrappy around the edges at the moment. Usually when I'm baking things, I'll try and smooth off as much as possible before I put it in the oven, but I don't want to disturb these rings too much, and we're going to be doing the resin, and then I can sand off after the resin anyway. So I'm not going to worry too much about neatening them off now. I'm just going to get them ready to go into the oven. So another thing that I quite often get asked about with these linking rings is, are they okay to go in the oven? Which, yes, they are. They're metal, so they're completely fine to go in the oven, because the oven's not reaching a high enough temperature to do anything bad to these rings. So perfectly fine in the oven. You can bake them without them discolouring or burning or anything like that. And whilst we're on the topic of baking, I'm going to pop these into my oven at 130 degrees Celsius, and I'm going to bake them for probably 45 minutes to an hour. That's what I usually do for all my clays. You can always bake longer than what's mentioned on the packet, but never hotter. If you bake hotter, it's going to burn, especially being translucent. We don't want to burn that translucent. So no hotter than the 130 degrees. Okay, so I thought I would show you what I'm going to do with some of the scraps. So I've used the scraps a couple of times, and this is what I've been left with. I got a smear of another colour in it somehow, but it actually inspired me to use this mould. So I'm going to cut out a couple of pieces, and then we're going to use this beautiful flower mould. So those translucent colouring plus that little like addition of the pinky orange that's through, straight away it reminded me of a frangipani flower. So I thought we'll just give this mould a go and see if we can sort of create a bit of a frangipani look with them. And I really like these double-sided moulds. It puts texture onto both sides of the flower, which just gives it a really realistic look, and they're really simple to use too. How cool is that? It turned out really well. So now I just need to add a little center. So I'm just going to put a little yellow paste in the middle and use my dotting tool to secure it in nicely and give that a little bit of texture too. And then it can go in the oven. Here are my pieces fresh out the oven. I'm really happy with how these have turned out. You can really see the veins of the paint that I added, and you can also just see a few little specks of that opal alcohol ink as well. I don't know if it's visible so much on camera. I'm going to take these outside in a minute, I think, to go and have a look properly. But yes, you can definitely see it, and so I'm really hoping that the resin we're going to apply will enhance it even more. And as I mentioned before, these are still a little rough around the edges. I'm not going to do the sanding until after I have resin coated. So just showing you each of these pieces here, they've turned out really well. I'm really happy with how they're looking. And then I've got those few little stud pieces as well, which I'll be using separate away from the ones with the rings. So I also baked up those flowers. So these are the two flowers and they look really awesome. And I think I'll just attach them onto a hoop and they can just hang freely on a hoop for earrings. So now it's time to apply the resin. Today I'm going to use the UV resin just because the sun UV rays outside is quite strong. So I am UVing in a different room because I don't want the sunlight coming through in my normal craft room to affect the resin. So I'm holding this by hand, making it very difficult. But anyway, you get the point. I'm going to apply the UV resin, take it outside to cure. And because I've got those linking rings on, it's really important to make sure that I bring that resin right to the edge to hold those rings in place. This piece actually looks super uneven here, but it is actually quite a flat piece. I think it's just the angle that I'm holding the camera on. Okay, so they are all done. They are super shiny now, and it really does enhance that iridescent look that is underneath, as well as the transparentness of the translucent clay. It looks really pretty and does definitely have that stone-like effect. I kind of wish I did more of these oval shapes. I really love the way that they've turned out. I think because it's more of a, I don't know, more natural stone sort of shape. I reckon these would be really pretty as rings. So I'm not going to assemble them as earrings. I'm going to see if I've got some ring findings. I think I might have some at the shop, so I'll have to find them over the next week or so and turn them into some rings. So I won't include them in the end of today's tutorial. So as I was just admiring these, I noticed that this stud here, I didn't spread the resin around. I must have just put it on top and then didn't spread it. So I'm going to see if I can fix that up. But these little ones turned out super cute. They'll make really nice little stud earrings. The rest of them I'm going to go and sand and drill and get them ready to make them into some earrings. Just before I do that though, I thought I would just quickly run outside and have a look at them in the natural sunlight, just to give you guys a proper look at how that translucent layering has worked out, and also how you can see those visible veins around the translucent. And as usual, I'm joined by my little doggies. Okay, so this brings me to the end of today's tutorial. I've now assembled these all together and I am really happy with the way they turned out. I still don't like the technique of making them. I don't know if it's just that I've seen it done way too many times, and I just don't like the mess and everything associated with it, but I am happy with how they turned out. I hope you guys have enjoyed coming along and watching me make them. And I hope that if you guys give it a go, you actually enjoy the process. So thanks again for joining me today, and I'll see you next week.